Good morning again from Sean Citizen from the largest lunatic asylum in Europe called Ireland. Now I want to speak about racism. Let's not be afraid of the word racism. The term racism has now been evacuated of meaning since it is now an empty smear hurled at any reporter or citizen who falls foul of the neoliberal agenda of Mr. Simon Coveney and Roderick O'Gorman, or who has been associated in any way with efforts to highlight the gross injustice in our housing allocation. Part of the government agenda is to control dissenting voices. Hence, new anti hate legislation has been placed on the statute books. It may be used to discourage journalists and so on from even discussing the open door policy of accepting and housing unlimited numbers of aliens of an entirely different culture who will never assimilate and accept our culture. Thus, the totalitarian tenor of our times. Some cultural practices of these new arrivals are horrific because genital mutilation, for example, is now illegal in Ireland, but many parents will bring their children on a holiday to their country of origin in Sudan or Somalia, where the barbaric procedure is performed away from prying eyes. I have had the good fortune to spend many winters in the Canary Islands, where the same problem has existed, and I have in a previous video outlined how it was resolved with some difficulty. The world is undergoing a global upheaval at present as never before seen. Africa, for example, is the epicenter of an unprecedented population exodus, as is the Middle East. There are millions of people living in extreme poverty in Africa. Despite poverty, Africa is experiencing brutal demographic growth, the highest in the world. The lack of education for responsible maternity, the scarce use of contraceptives, and the cultural and religious beliefs are causing this unprecedented population growth. The fertility rate of Africa is 4.7 births per mother, while in Europe it's around 1.2. And there's no problem at all in having as many children as you want, as long as you have enough resources in order to feed them and provide for them. Food, education, housing, etc. With these demographic numbers and birth rates, it is very hard for the great majority of families in Africa to provide for their offspring, and even harder to escape poverty when you have so many mouths to feed and stomachs to feed. This is not everything. Climate change is accelerating desertification in many African countries. Less rain means less water, less food, plus more people equals disaster. It's a very dangerous combination, and more conflicts are arising in that continent, making things even worse for millions of people. As these are all worsening problems in Africa, it's expected at least 400 million people will seek to emigrate to Europe in the next 50 years, which means around 8 million people a year. But what are the numbers so far? 2.7 million migrants entered the EU from non-EU countries in 2019. But that number is increasing rapidly. Most of them came from Africa and the Middle East. Many people here talk about letting immigrants move into Europe and Ireland and the rest other countries. But if it were an easy thing, just letting people arrive here, then what? How can we properly welcome and help almost 3 million people to establish themselves in Europe every year? It's a very complex situation for our governments, our institutions, and our societies. No reporters in Irish Times or anywhere else ever discuss this. Just because there are too many coming too fast to a territory already dealing with over 20 million unemployed youth in Europe. Yes, people have migrated before. 50 million Europeans went to North and South American countries in the last century. Still, they did so over a timeline actually of many centuries, and a workforce was urgently needed in the countries they arrived in. This is not the scene we have in Europe. But having said all this, we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. Need to try to reverse climate change or at least diminish its effects, keeping in mind that half of Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands are flooded, and the rest of Europe is fighting fires now in the summertime. Europe is not a wonderland anymore. We have problems of our own, big problems. Also, we need to see how and if Africa is going to do something to control its rapidly chaotic population growth. From my point of view, they won't succeed in doing so, even if they try to put in place radical measures in each and every African country. Europe will not be able to welcome all of, all of them, or even a small percentage of them. Not because we don't want to, but because we can't. The only hope for the African people, actually, is in Russia, the biggest country in Europe, in the world, rather not in Europe, but in the world, with an area of 17 million square kilometres and only 144 million inhabitants, while the European Union's total area is only 4.4 million kilometres and holds almost 500 million people. Most of the Russian territory is actually empty, and if Russia opened its doors to the African people, millions could be saved. There are 200 million poor people in Nigeria alone. Europe will find itself forced to close its borders in order to survive. We won't be able to bring millions on board unless we want to sink with them. It's no pleasure for me to write this, and it breaks my heart. However, the truth needs to be said and needs to be faced. The sooner the better. We Europeans have welcomed millions with open arms, but very much to our regret, we cannot continue doing so. Statistics released to a member of the public by the Department of Justice on the foot of a Freedom of Information request provide an insight into what appears to be an astonishing level of laxity when it comes to admitting persons who wish to claim asylum in Ireland. The number of people in the last 5 years that have disembarked on aircraft at Dublin Airport claiming asylum but not providing a passport. In response to this request, how many people have arrived at Dublin Airport without a passport and who subsequently applied for asylum here? It should be borne in mind that any Irish citizen failing to produce identifying documentation in any other state would be refused admission. As a citizen of a safe country, it's highly unlikely too that any Irish citizen failing to do so would be granted leave to stay in any other country rather than being sent back to Ireland, the place they came from, or perhaps even detained at the airport. In Ireland, however, it seems that arriving here from anywhere in the world, and in almost every case on a flight, not only from another safe country, but from a country that is not the one the undocumented person is claiming to be fleeing, is almost a cast iron guarantee of being allowed to stay here for an indeterminate period. To the end of July this year, 2,915 people who have arrived in Dublin have failed to produce a passport or other identifying document. Of that 2,232, more than 75%, of such persons have been allowed to claim asylum rather than being sent back to where they came from. And if that sounds oppressive, consider this. None of these people would have been allowed onto a flight in whichever country they came from unless they had been able to produce a valid passport and unless they had a valid flight ticket, which presumably most of those arriving here also failed to produce. That means that the persons concerned have destroyed their passport and other documentation while on the flight to Dublin, a city that surely occupies the place in the world of illegal immigrants and their facilitators, as Charlie's Chocolate Factory does for children in Roald Dahl's fantasy. Except that the growing level of illegal immigration here is neither a fancy nor likely to end in even the mildest rebuke. Quite the opposite, as we know from the record. There are 60 million poor people in South Africa, 14 million in Zimbabwe, Syria and Afghanistan another 100 million, Algeria, Morocco, North African states 40 million. So, at what point does Simon Coveney, Roderick O'Gorman, and even Sinn Féin and people before profit feel we have enough of it all? How many? How many million? We are a small island of 5 million people. If we take in 1% of all the aforementioned economic migrants, the Irish as an ethnic group within Europe will cease to be and will be a minority in their own country. Thank you from Sean Citizen reporting from the largest lunatic asylum in the world. It's called Ireland.